Hey, good morning, everyone. It's Sunday, November 3rd. I'm Mark Dent, and you're listening to The Hustle Daily Show. So we're coming up on the home stretch of 2024. November, December, and the holidays are here, which means that we're also about to see some of Hollywood's most anticipated movies get released. Some of the hyped titles this year include Gladiator 2, a film version of the Broadway hit Wicked, and Mufasa, which is a prequel to The Lion King. As you might imagine, if you follow the movie business at all, none of these films are cheap. Mufasa reportedly cost around $190 million to make. Gladiator 2 might have cost as much as $300 million. And Wicked reportedly cost $145 million, and it's been delayed for about 5 years. The studios that made these films certainly have high hopes that these are all going to excel. But more than likely one of them, or some other hyped release from this winter, is going to be a flop. It won't recoup its budget, it will face withering critical reviews, and it could land the director or the stars of the film in some very hot water. So how do flops happen? And how does a business as well-funded and as savvy as Hollywood still have such a bad rate of failure? Tim Robey dug into the history of Hollywood flops to find out. Robey is a longtime film critic at The Telegraph and the author of Box Office Poison, Hollywood's Story in a Century of Flops. Tim, thanks for coming on to The Hustle Daily Show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so the first thing I wanted to ask is, how do you really define a flop? And then secondly, why is that a good vehicle to take us through the history of Hollywood?
So I needed to narrow down the subject because obviously a lot of films could be considered failures in some respect if they're badly reviewed or whatever. But I thought I'm going to go with the commercial definition of a flop, a movie that really lost a lot of money for the studio or the financial backers who made it. And I'm talking about losing a significant proportion of the production budget. So among the films that you just mentioned, for example, if Gladiator 2 were to gross less than $300 million worldwide, then that would be considered a huge flop, really, because that is its production budget, before you even add on the costs of marketing and distribution.
Right. Which can obviously add on, an extra $50 million to a film's budget easily for a big film.
Way more than that. You often double the figure, quite honestly.
Oh, wow.
But in answer to your second part of your question, I thought it would be a very interesting exercise to go through Hollywood history chronologically, starting in the silent era, and look at some of the biggest flops and see, A, what Hollywood learned from them at the time and what kind of course correction might have happened after these films failed really badly, and B, what we can still learn from them in terms of the way that Hollywood economics work and the kind of running threads that go through the book, which teach us again and again what happens when certain problems arise.
And there's obviously been, a lot of books written about Hollywood. There's books that come out where someone will write like an entire history of like a certain movie. And they usually pick like the really good ones. They'll pick like the Citizen Kanes, they'll pick the Casablancas, they'll pick classics like that. But I'm just wondering, like, why do you think failure is a more perhaps interesting way to really learn about the intricacies of how this business works?
I think it's possibly because failure is rarely expected. Like, no one sets out to make a flop. And the early stages of some of these films being put together, everyone thought they were going to be a big deal. An example would be William Friedkin's movie Sorcerer in the 70s. He'd just done The Exorcist. He was the big man in Hollywood. And he was allowed to make this film with a $22 million budget, an adventure movie in South America. He thought it was going to be like the highlight of his career. And then it was absolutely destroyed at the box office by Star Wars, which was an unexpected hit. No one thought Star Wars was going to do quite so well. And failure, I think, is just more interesting to read about because there's a certain sense of, a hubris that can become attached to a filmmaking project. The budget gets inflated. Everyone is kind of getting overhyped for the movie, and then it crashes and burns. That is a kind of a compelling saga to tell. And I found in researching the book that those were really fun exercises to dig into.
And like you said, you started 100 years ago. I mean, you started before even sound had really been introduced to film. So this has been happening for a long time. I'm curious, in those really old days of Hollywood, were flops more common than you'd see more in the sort of modern era of the last few decades? Or was it something that where actually Hollywood kind of had it together in those early days?
It's actually quite a difficult question to answer that. And the reason is that financial data for early films is very scarce. It's hard to come by. There are only a few instances where a film was very, very high budgeted and lost a lot of money where we know that that happened. And I chose those for the book. So I've got one film, Intolerance, from 1916, which was D.W. Griffith's follow-up to his enormously successful The Birth of a Nation. And then I've got a film called Queen Kelly from 1929, which got caught up in the transition to sound. It was like the last silent movie in a way. And by the time it was released as a silent movie, it was way too late. Everyone was it was sound or nothing. So I found those out because I tracked down the budgets for those films and so on. But it's really difficult to say, given the number of films in the silent era that were being produced, how many of them were profitable. Quite hard to answer. These days, we know that data quite minutely, and we can kind of track how much a film is making in the US versus China versus the rest of the world. And we know those figures. So it's kind of pretty obvious if a film at least gets a theatrical release, whether it's done well or not. Where they can hide the movies these days is on streaming.
Right.
Because on streaming services, we have no indication of how many people are watching them. So sometimes a film that is sort of sussed out that it might be in trouble or it's possibly in danger of being a flop, they'll put it straight to streaming and then no one knows. It's a good way to protect everyone's reputations.
Yeah, a very, very new way to protect them for sure. So was there a time also, I think you wrote about this somewhere in the book, where there was at least a point where maybe like the general public started to become a little bit more aware of box office returns. And I think maybe that was also the case with budgets. They get reported at least in like the trade publications like Variety and, the Hollywood Reporter and things like that. I know you mentioned that it's hard to tell exactly which ones failed and succeeded in the early days, but was Hollywood always just sort of driven by the bottom line, or was it ever more of a utopian sort of world where it's like, let's just think about making a good film?
There are certain filmmakers who were allowed to continue working, almost regardless of how much money their films were grossing. If you take someone like Howard Hawks, his films did not make a great deal of money. His biggest hit was Sergeant York in the early 40s. And then he thought he had a shot in the 50s at making a really big commercial film, which was Land of the Pharaohs, which is one of the chapters in my book. And he persuaded Warner Brothers to give him a big budget to make this huge Egyptian epic. But it just fell down around him in tatters because the script was not ready. And his kind of understanding of the ancient world was not really good enough to make the film convincing. The casting was a problem. There were so many things that went wrong with that film. But in terms of the kind of idea that the American public especially take an interest in, how well a film is doing across the breakfast tables, reading the newspapers the Monday after opening weekend, I think that crept in really in the 70s and 80s. There's a certain moment where more attention is paid. It becomes almost like a sport to kind of like see, oh, did you see which movie just flopped really badly this weekend? Or did you see how well this other film did? And I think you can kind of see the equivalence there. You can see it happening at the same moment that, Jaws and Star Wars changed the economics of blockbusters in the industry. At the same time that those films are making a fortune, there are other filmmakers who are really struggling, and the reporting on those films becomes something that the mainstream press takes a real interest in. I'm talking about films like Heaven's Gate, Michael Cimino's famous disaster from 1980. Someone snuck on set for that film. This was a journalist to report on how chaotic it was getting. Apocalypse Now in the Philippines was running hugely over budget and hugely over schedule, and everyone thought it was going to be the big flop of Francis Ford Coppola's career. Everyone in the press started calling it Apocalypse Later or Apocalypse When, because it was taking so long. In fact, though, he had redemption with that one, because when it did come out, it did very, very well.
Yeah, and what are these sort of implications of when a movie flops, particularly as we're talking about the more modern era, like you were saying, picking up around the 70s, 80s, 90s, and more into the 21st century, and when people really started paying attention to these kind of finances? I know that one movie that you've focused on is Cutthroat Island from the mid-90s. And the production company that was in charge of that was an independent one. And they ended up filing for bankruptcy, I think, even before it was released. I think for a lot of people, they just think, well, there's so many movies that come out. How could one just make such a huge difference? But they do. What are the impacts just one flop can have?
Yeah, I mentioned Heaven's Gate a minute ago. I didn't do a chapter on that film because it's been written about a lot.
Yeah.
But it did bankrupt United Artists. They folded when that film came out because it lost so much money. When 20th Century Fox were making Cleopatra, they were really broke because it was costing them so much. It cost about $44 million, which is adjusted for inflation, an extraordinary sum. It might be $450 million now, something like that. And again, they had to push so much money into promoting that movie to make it work. And it still scraped its way to number one at the box office for 1963. But Cutthroat Island, I consider a very unlucky example because I don't think the film itself was the reason for the company going under. As you mentioned, they were already in trouble. In fact, Carolco, which was the company, had borrowed a lot of money to make Cutthroat Island. It was their last chance. They had had huge hits with Terminator 2 and Basic Instinct, but they'd also got into a lot of debt. And when they made Cliffhanger, they had to borrow a lot of money from other studios to put the film together. It paid off. That film did well, but then they needed another one. They threw money into a project about the Crusades, which Paul Verhoeven was going to make with Arnold Schwarzenegger, but that fell apart. Paul Verhoeven walked off it and never got made. Then their last chance was Cutthroat Island, so they threw all their remaining eggs into the basket of Cutthroat Island, which was just not ready as a screenplay. And Michael Douglas, who was supposed to be in the lead role, jumped off the film weeks before it was shooting, leaving Gina Davis kind of stranded in her part. They recast Michael Douglas's role with Matthew Modine, and then the film just began spiraling out of control. Nothing that Carolco could do from then on was going to block the finger in the dam, if you like. It was game over. So by the time that film limped out into cinemas, the company had folded and MGM were being sold, and there was not even any money left to even promote it or kind of give it any kind of chance at the box office, which is why it was dollar for dollar one of the most unsuccessful films ever.
So the fact that these studios are paying, $100 million, $300 million perhaps, that's an awful lot of money just to finance one of these big movies. It's just inherently risky to make films. I mean, it's an ordeal to come up with enough money. And if you make enough of those, then at some point, one of them could potentially sink you.
That is absolutely true. And it's why Hollywood is so famously risk averse about pouring those sums into an original project, and why they're always much more content to throw that kind of money at a sequel. And they're especially wary of pouring them into projects that are original concepts, if you like, a screenplay from nothing, which is why Cutthroat Island was quite a big risk. They always want to play it safe by establishing a franchise and then spending their money on the sequels, continuing that way. But then sometimes even that doesn't pay off. I focus on Speed 2. Mm-hmm. Speed 2 Cruise Control in the summer of 1997. Now,
I'm a rare fan of Speed 2.
Oh, you like it? Okay, that's fair. That's fine. I'm not the biggest fan, but I also think the main problem with that movie was the rush that it was made in. They were making Titanic. This was 20th Century Fox. Were making Titanic at the same time. So they had two movies set on water, which is always difficult. It's always expensive. It often causes problems. It nearly sent Spielberg into a total depression when he was making Jaws. And Titanic was supposed to come out in the summer of 1997, but was taking so long. It was such a big, complicated, infamously difficult production that they shunted it back to Christmas. And that left them with nothing to come out in the summer. So they pushed Speed 2 into production. The quickest thing about it, I'm going to say, was how quickly it was made and forced into production. Because the problem with the movie, which even Keanu Reeves noticed, is that it's set on a very slow boat. So the idea of following Speed with this movie that's set on a cruise ship that can only go at about 20 miles per hour was very misguided. And the fact that Keanu Reeves couldn't get enthused about it meant that he refused to come back. They had to cast Jason Patric instead. Sandra Bullock came back because she wanted to make another film for 20th Century Fox. But it was all so hasty, and there was no script that was going to kind of work on that movie. And audiences got wind of this, I think. Audiences realized this was not the sequel to Speed that they actually wanted. And so it did really badly. And it was the rare instance of a sequel that does so badly that it actually kills off the franchise. There's never been a Speed 3. Normally, we assume that Hollywood sequels, even when they're kind of lazy, will still make dollar. But this was the exception that almost proves the rule.
Yeah. And so just a few years after that, one of the other movies that you write about is Geely, which is a famously bad, at least, romantic comedy that starred Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez about the time when they were first kind of having a relationship. And you wrote that Geely's failure in some ways upended an entire business model for Hollywood. What did you mean by that? And what kind of models have we seen that have been ushered in after Geely?
Yes, so Geely was kind of the baby of a company called Revolution Studios that was founded by Joe Roth, who had very good relationships with big movie stars such as Julia Roberts. And he would entice them into his company to make films with huge paychecks. The actors would get a big paycheck, so they would be really encouraged to come in and kind of do whatever script he wanted them to do, essentially. So the business model was simply, if you get Julia Roberts, then you're golden. If you get Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez at sort of a certain peak moment in their career when they're going to, be given their biggest paycheck ever, they got like $12-13 million, then everything else will fall into place behind you. But unfortunately, that just assumes that any old script will do. And the business model, that's not sustainable, because when a script comes along like Gigli, which is incredibly eccentric, strange mishmash of genres, it's kind of like a kind of gangster crime comedy rom-com in which J-Lo's character is a lesbian, but Ben Affleck seduces her anyway. There's a lot of very weird conversations about sex in it. There's another character in it with mental difficulties who is very insensitively portrayed. With all of that going on in the script, it was very unmanageable and hard to sell. The marketing department at Sony, who released it, had huge trouble making it clear to audiences what the film even was or how to pronounce it. And at the same time, Ben Affleck and Jennifer Lopez were becoming the most kind of overexposed celebrity couple of the day. And I think the fact they were on all the magazine covers, people were just fed up of them. People did not want to go and watch Bennifer the movie, if you like. So the film, everyone could see as it was going into post-production that it was going to fail badly. And it really did. It was the mega bomb of 2003. And it kind of sent everyone involved, into hiding almost. The director has never made another film again. This is Martin Brest.
Wow.
But the business model of Revolution Studios, which was to hand out these huge paychecks to actors, regardless of what they were making, that wasn't going to work anymore. And within a few years, the business model in Hollywood really did change, because instead of that, you end up with the Marvel Cinematic Universe, in which you essentially come up with the character and the concept, and then you find an actor who you can hire at not too great an expense initially to take on the role. That actor is then kind of almost forever associated with that role.
Yeah. And so that's kind of like the IP model, right, that Hollywood talks about, where there needs to be some sort of existing IP, like where it's, for superheroes, it was the comic books. Sometimes it might just be like a popular novel, maybe like in the case of something like Hunger Games. And, you've already said that we don't see as many flops now, in part because when a movie gets really bad, a studio might just decide to sell it to Netflix, which will pay a lot of money for it seems, by the way. Something like sometimes 50 to 100 million, right?
That's right. Yeah. Netflix throw money at these things. I mean,
yeah.
I don't quite know sometimes what the budgets of those films are. There are a lot of films that get put out on Netflix. It started to accelerate that process during the pandemic.
Yeah.
Because obviously cinemas weren't open. So,
Right.
There wasn't anywhere to bring these films out other than straight to streaming.
But also in this IP era, do you think Hollywood has then gotten better at avoiding flops by kind of following this newer model instead of like let's just find a couple stars and then put them into something? Or is Hollywood still kind of a business where you never know what's going to happen?
Flops still come along, and we've had quite a few this year. It's been a floppy year. If you look at the Francis Ford Coppola film, Megalopolis, and also Joker, Folie à Deux. Now, Joker, you'd have thought, because the first film made over $1 billion worldwide, was a huge hit. You'd have thought it was a kind of a foolproof franchise by then. But the filmmakers just decided to kind of go bonkers with the second film, to make it a musical, to cast Lady Gaga, and to do all these things that seemed to kind of repudiate what people liked about the first movie. So there was almost a sense of self-sabotage with that film, which I think caused it to heavily, hugely underperform at the box office. An enormous flop, actually. And so that proves that Hollywood is still, if you like, willing to indulge risk-taking from filmmakers, even within the IP kind of zone you're talking about. And also, even when there's not failing because of risks being taken, it can still fail. Look at the fate of Batgirl, which was supposed to be a DC Comics movie made a couple of years ago. They made the decision to sort of pull the plug on it after they'd already shot it, because they figured that it would damage the brand too much if they brought it out. That there was this really cold calculation made just to kind of throw it in the bin, rather than spending the extra money to finish all the effects and to release it. And I feel that if Catwoman, which I do focus on in my book from 2004, were made today, it would probably suffer a similar fate. There's more of a ruthless side to kind of not throwing good money after bad, and to essentially terminate such a project before it can actually cause real commercial damage at the box office.
We're even seeing, like you said, movies that should be, all things considered, fairly safe bets in this IP kind of world that we're in. Some of those flops you just mentioned, like the sequel to The Joker from this year, Marvel's last year, which famously was the worst performing Marvel Cinematic Universe film. Do you think the fact that some of those movies have flopped will lead Hollywood to reconsider its current go-to business model that it has been following for the last, couple decades?
I think it certainly will be. There are always course corrections. One of the ideas in my book is that flops actually dictate those, or at least kind of suggest them, just as much as the big hits do. That when a film fails, it makes everyone sit back and kind of like reconsider how they're going about things. But also the nature of Hollywood and also the nature of film-going appetites is very cyclical, and it comes in phases. So what works in 2008, when Iron Man was a runaway hit and launched the Marvel Cinematic Universe for a very, very profitable decade, what works over that decade isn't necessarily sustainable because people start to get bored of it. Superhero fatigue, I think, is the main reason why the Marvels and Eternals and some of the other recent examples of unsuccessful Marvel movies have not done well. People are kind of sated. They've had enough of that stuff. So it's actually a creative challenge then for Hollywood to kind of come up with franchises that people are willing to go back to, or, dare I say it, inventing new ones, which is still the thing that Hollywood struggles with the most, finding a new franchise that's really going to pay off.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like Hollywood learns a lot, but we'll always have a lot to learn. All right. Well, Tim, thank you again for joining us here on the Hustle Daily Show.
Thanks so much for having me.
Tim is the author of Box Office Poison, Hollywood's Story in a Century of Flops. That book is out in stores on November 5th. You can already pre-order it if you would like, and I highly recommend it. It's a very entertaining, informative read. Thank you, everyone, for tuning into the Hustle Daily Show. We're a proud part of the HubSpot podcast network. Our editor today is Robert Hartwig, and our executive producer is Darren Clark. We've got a lot more tech and business coverage in our newsletter, so if you're not subscribed, please go get signed up at thehustle.co/email, and we will see you tomorrow.
With smaller budgets, shorter timelines, and sky-high expectations, growth is feeling pretty painful right now. But HubSpot is here to help. They just announced more than 200 major product updates that'll make impossible business growth feel impossibly easy. Like Breeze, HubSpot's suite of new AI tools that help you say goodbye to busy work and hello to better work. There's Breeze Copilot, a sidekick to assist you with all your tasks and boost productivity, Breeze Agents to automate manual, time-consuming work and add expertise, and Breeze Intelligence to give you the richest, most comprehensive picture of your prospects you know which are most likely to become loyal customers. They've also reimagined their marketing and content hubs with all new ways to create breakthrough content, updated features to generate better leads, and lots more to uplevel your marketing and your revenue forecast. Get ready for growth without the growing pains. Visit HubSpot.com/spotlight to see them all and demo for yourself.
If you're struggling to keep up with all the latest innovations in tech and what they'll mean for your life, TED Tech has you covered. Get ahead of the curve with digestible downloads on some of the biggest ideas in technology, from AI and virtual reality to clean tech. Find TED Tech wherever you get your podcasts.
Hey, what's up, everybody? I've been listening to this awesome podcast lately. It's called Hustle and Flowchart, hosted by Joe Fear, and it's brought to you by the HubSpot Podcast Network, the audio destination for business professionals. The Hustle and Flowchart podcast with Joe Fear is all about how to build a business so it gives you the freedom and fuel for your life. You can join Joe as he discusses systems, mindset tweaks, reframes, and strategies for entrepreneurs, and really anyone, to be honest, to enjoy the process of being in business and also having fun. This isn't just for the entrepreneur looking to make $1 billion business, but it's also for somebody who's looking to build systems that work for you so you can make more money than you need just by working part-time, essentially. I was actually just listening to an episode he had on Kareen Walsh behind the app Hey Kareen, and Kareen talked a lot about how to scale your business effectively, especially if you're just a startup, especially if you are just an app startup specifically. It's an awesome episode. I would recommend it to anyone. You can check them out, and you can listen to the Hustle and Flowchart wherever you get your podcasts.